Please, let me go." She was bound in the square for shame, but the cowboy untied her and asked, "Dry Hollow, New Mexico Territory, 1883, heat pressed down like a hand. Dust hung in the square, tasting of tin. Clara Wade, 22, stood bound to a splintered post, dress torn, cheek bruised, hair stuck to her throat. A rotten apple burst at her feet. "Please, let me go." Her voice cracked and vanished in the glare. "That's what you get for tempting honest men," a woman hissed, and a boy threw pebbles the size of teeth. The sheriff leaned in a doorway, boots crossed, eyes bored. A church bell ticked like a slow fuse. Clara counted heartbeats to keep from drowning. 1, 2. The rope burned her wrists. Shame burned deeper. Then the crowd shifted, as if the wind had turned. Boots, not hurried. Certain, a rider dismounted at the trough and walked, hat brim low, coat mapped by long miles. No badge, no smile, storm-gray eyes. He didn't look at the sheriff. He looked at the knots, then at Clara, as if measuring a story no one else could read. Someone whispered, "Elias Holt," the name sliding through the grass. He paused beside a notice board, where a faded wanted poster flapped. Elias's name inked once, crossed out with a stamp, cleared. Gasps. A girl dropped a peach. It rolled until it kissed Clara's heel. Elias set a small iron key on the water barrel. A lock wasn't in sight. He lifted a gloved hand, and the square obeyed now. "Sheriff," he said, voice quiet, dangerous. No answer. A fly worried the sweat on Clara's temple. Elias stepped closer. Clara smelled pine and rain. "You're punishing the wrong woman," he said. "Not to the town, but to her." Clara's breath hitched. He knew something. He leaned in, shadow covering her shame. What he said next would change her life forever. Heat hammered the square. Clara Wade tasted dust while jeers bounced around the post. A peach burst near her toes. "See what happens to tempters," a man crowed. Another voice sharpened the insult and threw it like a stone. The sheriff leaned in a doorway, boots crossed, eyes flat. Rope bit Clara's wrists until fire traveled up her arms. She swallowed air that cut her throat, counted breaths, tried not to fold. Bootsteps cut through the noise. People shifted with wary attention, tall, silent, hat brim low over a jaw roughened by travel. The coat is scuffed by miles, no badge. Storm-gray eyes weighing rope first, the sheriff second, the crowd not at all. He stopped beside the trough where water held a sliver of sky. "Sheriff," he said. The lawman rolled a toothpick. "Afternoon," he drawled. "Town keeps order." "Untie her," the stranger said. A woman clicked her tongue. She earned it. The stranger's gaze returned to Clara's wrists. "Untie her," he repeated. "Who says?" the sheriff asked. "Elias Holt," someone whispered. The name moved through dust like a rumor. A rancher without a brand, a card player who never smiled. Elias ignored the stories. He waited. "No," the sheriff said. Elias reached for the rope. A farmhand twitched near his belt. Elias looked at the hand and the man who owned it. Movement died. A knife came free with a soft sound. Steel kissed hemp, fibers sighed apart. Ropes fell, wrists turning from bound to bruised. Clara's arms dropped, her knees threatened to follow. Elias caught her without flourish. His coat smelled of pine and smoke. The cheer that should have come never did. "You don't give orders here," the sheriff said. "You gave none," Elias answered. He set his body between Clara and eyes that loved verdicts. "If you punish her for being alone, let me stand with her." Silence jumped. Margaret Voss, the mayor's wife, arranged her certainty. She brought this upon herself. "Then keep your certainty," Elias said. "I'll keep her alive." Dust swirled. The sheriff weighed fists, mistakes, regret. Perhaps he remembered how the knife had moved. Perhaps he remembered the way crowds turn on men who misread storms. He holstered his stare. "Take her," he said. Elias put Clara on her feet. "Can you walk?" he asked, and let the question wait. She nodded. They crossed the square while gazes bent to study boards. The wagon stood ready. He lifted her to the plank, climbed after, and set the team moving with the touch of a man who treats strength as something horses lend. Dry Hollow shrank. Hotel sign, jailhouse porch, water tower, a cottonwood with small leaves. Prairie took over, wide and stubborn. Hooves thudded, wheels hummed. Clara watched from a distance because staring at safety makes it vanish. Elias kept the reins loose and his mouth closed. Questions become traps. He refused to set any. "You don't know me," she said when her throat allowed sound. "I know shame doing work it was never hired to do," he said. "That qualifies me for today." They passed a creek thin as wire and a hawk pinned to blue. The wagon's shadow traveled beside them like a second chance. Elias's profile was made of simple lines arranged to last. A faint scar whitened one knuckle. The coat she had leaned against showed a neat mend. He drove like a man who had learned patience, beating speed. Cabin arrived out of the land, the way answers arrive, out of silence. Not big, not new. Logs weathered dark. Porch rail rubbed smooth. Shirts on a line. He stopped in the shade, tied off, and offered a palm without demand. She stepped down as if gravity had softened. No order hid in his touch. Inside smelled of wood smoke and soap. A table without clutter. Shelf with tin plates. A chair pushed back as if a thought had risen too fast. Bed in the corner under a quilt the color of ponds. At dusk, he poured water, set bread, and placed a light blanket near, heavy enough to convince nerves they were no longer in a square. Then he looked out the window, giving her a corridor of privacy the day had denied. "There's a basin," he said. "Buckets full. Take the time you require." He stood in the door and let the yard fill his eyes. She washed grit from her face and found a mouth that still belonged to her. Rope burns lifted from red toward pink. She dried with a cloth that smelled faintly of sun. "This place keeps no ledger," he said. "Work if you wish, rest if you need. Silence is welcome. Ledger. Towns keep them. Churches hide them inside sermons. People carry them behind their teeth." Something unclenched. She ate because he didn't watch. Strength returns quickest when nobody times it. Evening walked onto the floorboards. He lit a lamp low enough to glow, not glare. Coyotes tuned themselves somewhere distant. She asked the question, waiting beside her third. "Why did you do it?" Elias rested a palm on the sill. "Once," he said. "Someone I loved was judged in a square like that." She was younger and quicker to laugh. A man took what he wanted and called it a misunderstanding. Town nodded because nodding is easy. She carried the weight nobody tried to lift. "I arrived too late to stop the worst. Afterward, I hunted the ones who taught everyone to point. Most days I found a mirror and hated what it showed." He set a folded shirt on the bed, alone until hers could be mended, and a small bundle on the table. "Soap, needle, thread. You don't owe me gratitude," he said. "Today required a witness willing to move. I moved." Clara looked at the door as if the square might pour over the horizon and flood this room. It didn't. The walls held. The blanket steadied her breathing. She thought of hatpins, a toothpick on a lazy lip. The word tempter thrown like a lasso. She thought of a knife making quiet work of rope and hands catching without claiming. He pulled a chair onto the porch and sat where she could see him if seeing meant safety. Crickets tuned another note. Stars pricked through blue. A breeze slid through the window and spread the lamp's small flame. She stood in the doorway, not ready to choose the bed. Not required to. The world had given her orders all day. This house offered options and wait. Crickets answered one another across the grass, and a night breeze carried the clean scent of cut hay. From the barn came a horse's soft stomp. Then stillness. Clara loosened the blanket, feeling its weight turn from shield to comfort. Elias stayed where he was, present without pressure, letting quiet do the rest tonight. When breath grew longer than fear, she stepped onto the porch and leaned against a post that would never hold ropes. The horizon bled red into purple. "Why help me?" she whispered. Elias turned, weather in his eyes. "Some wrongs get nailed shut in public," he said. "Opening one buys back a piece of yourself. Redemption spends slowly. I am trying to afford it." Morning slid across the prairie in thin gold, and the cabin breathed pine and banked coals. Clara woke beneath a quilt sewn in quiet colors, the kind that announces safety without boasting. On the table a basin steamed, a clean cloth folded square over the rim, and beside it sat 2 biscuits under a tin plate, turned like a lid. A kettle muttered on the stove. Elias had left the fire coaxed to life, then stepped outside before she stirred. She washed, flinched at the sting along rope marks, and watched mist film the window, then vanish. Out back, hooves shifted. A curry comb flicked softly. His footsteps crossed the porch, paused, moved on. He gave her the morning without question. That, more than heat or bread, steadied her. She ate a biscuit and tasted honey hiding in the crumb. She folded the blanket from the bed, shook the quilt, and set the cloth back exactly as she found it. Small tasks waited like shy visitors. She let each in. Elias opened the door, left a split log by the box, and nodded toward the stove. "Coffee's ready," he said, then fixed his eyes on the yard, so hers could land wherever they wished. She poured and sat near the hearth, while flame answered the new fuel with a polite crackle. Outside, the cottonwood traded shadows with the low sun. A wagon rattled past the far fence. Voices rode the boards, dipped, then sharpened on her name before fading. She did nothing but breathe until the dust settled back into teasing spirals. Elias set his hat on a peg and cleaned his hands at the basin. "Eat what you like," he said, "or leave it be." No sermon sat behind the words. She nodded, grateful for plain choices. After a while she lifted the broom, waited at the threshold, and asked, "May I?" "It's your floor while you stand on it," he answered. She swept with steady strokes, guided dust into daylight, and felt breath find an even lane. Part of her kept watch for command, scold or sigh. None arrived. She returned the broom, straightened the table, and folded a towel so its corners met. The room seemed to welcome such unremarkable order. Through the doorway she saw him check a fetlock, smooth a bridle, and tuck half an apple into the mare's patient mouth. Kindness arranged in fragments can build a scaffold for a shaken soul. Mid-morning wind carried town talk like burrs riding wool. 2 riders slowed near the lane, pretending to adjust a cinch while their eyes crawled over the porch. One tipped his chin toward the doorway and breathed a slur shaped to cut quickly. They moved on after measuring the yard, and the woman in Clara's shoulders stiffened, then eased when the voices didn't circle back. She pressed the folded towel with her palm until the cloth lay flat. Elias returned with pitch pine, shaved a sliver, and fed the fire until resin sweetened the air. "Flowers in the bin," he said. "Salt, beans, sugar high up." A laugh broke from her when he added, "Sugar hides so children must hunt magic." His mouth didn't tilt, yet something behind his eyes turned gentle. She sat on the step and let warmth press across her spine. "Have you ever found healing in the smallest gestures? Share your story below." She heard her own voice as a murmur meant for somebody far away. "Small is where most things begin," Elias said. They watched a hawk write an invisible sentence over the grass, until it vanished. She told him when the quiet grew strong enough to hold words. "I was left at a mission when I could still count years on one hand," she said. "The church said discipline made saints. I learned silence made targets. A woman with a hard jaw used scripture like a lamp. A man with soft hands used piety like a door he shut after entering. They said ruin followed me into rooms. Her throat wanted to close. She made it stay open. I worked, scrubbed, stitched, bowed, and never emptied their ledger. By 15 I knew how to disappear while standing still." Elias listened the way a good fence holds cattle, quiet, firm, with enough give that nothing breaks. He didn't gasp or grind his teeth. He let the story land where it wished. After a while he said, "My sister believed blame was her birthright. A man taught her that lie, and the town agreed because agreement spares effort. By the time I understood, shame owned the house. She went where I could not follow." He looked toward the hills, and the space between them did the weeping neither of them wanted. Clara touched the cloth at her wrist and found the sting had faded to a tingle. Pain, when met gently, learns new manners. At noon he left a small jar, waxed lid tied with thread, balm smelling of mint and tallow. "For burns," he said, and went to mend a ray. She drew a thin gleam across the red bands, until heat stepped back. He brought fresh water and slid a folded shirt onto the bed. Alone without terms, she mended a frayed towel, stitches small and sure. A boy on a mule clattered past with letters and loose talk. "They say Holt kept a sinner," he blurted, then flushed. I'm repeating, not choosing. Choose better, Elias said, calm as shade. The boy tipped his hat and went on. Clara let the dust fall without settling in her chest. She poured coffee, split the biscuit, and pushed half toward Elias. He broke that half again and gave a piece back. Only fairness. Birds stitched the eaves to the sky. The yard turned amber. By the door, a small trowel leaned with a twist of paper tied around its handle. Seeds rattled faintly. By the trough, Elias said, sun lands there kindly. She knelt where soil yielded. Metal slid through the earth with a sound like relief. She made a row, placed seeds with measured spacing, and drew a veil of brown over their backs. Water from the dipper darkened the line. Elias stood off, keeping watch without enclosing the moment. Silence did the teaching. She planted a second row and smoothed it with the side of her hand. Pine scented the air. Shadows lengthened. The trough turned black as a mirror for stars. A coyote called. Another answered. Clara pressed her palm to the soil and felt warmth slip into her skin. Proof that spite could not starve life if invited. She set the trowel upright and wiped her fingers on her skirt, leaving honest smudges. Elias pushed a scrap stake into the earth. Name it, he said. She tied a thread from the muslin around the stake and chose silence over labels. The doorway breathed a faint draft, lifting the curtain an inch. She pinched the last seeds into a pocket, cupped water over the place, and watched it vanish. Care settled across her shoulders. She stayed until dusk softened the yard, tending that small herb garden, each motion the size of a breath, each breath a step toward hope. The wind tilted the cottonwood when the riders came. Hooves beat iron on dry earth, and dust climbed the steps like an uninvited guest. Elias stacked split logs beside the door. Clara watered herbs with a chipped dipper. Sleeves rolled. She heard the jingling Holt, leather creak, and the tone she remembered from the square, a tone shaped for verdicts. Margaret Voss sat tall in a riding skirt, posture trained by years of petitions and punishments, and townsfolk gathered around her in a ragged ring. Men with sunburnt cheeks, 2 shopkeepers in Sunday coats, the schoolmistress with stiff gloves, even the mail boy who carried whispers, all watching the cabin, as if it had sprouted horns. This house shelters a scandal, Margaret called. Send the girl out, Elias Holt, and end this foolishness. Clara set the dipper down. Fear came quick and sharp, then steadied when her fingers found the daisy he had left by her cup at dawn. She pressed the cool stem until it reminded her that the world still held softness. Elias walked to the porch edge, hat brim low, jaw roughened by miles, storm-gray calm in his eyes, hands open where everyone could see them. He surveyed the horses without counting. The group fanned into a crescent, leather creaking while courage swelled and failed across faces. You rode far for gossip, he said. We rode to protect Dry Hollow, Margaret answered. You brought sin to our border. That woman invites ruin. Give her up and prove you stand for order. She stands under my roof, he said, and no harm touches a person I shelter. Murmurs spread like burrs in wool. A rancher spat a brown line. The schoolmistress kept her chin high and eyes down. Margaret's gelding tossed its head. We demand her removal, she said. Now. Elias set his palm against a porch post, scarred by weather. No. He let the word lie flat and heavy, like a stone. A rider shifted, hand grazing a rifle butt. Elias's gaze touched the movement and drifted back to Margaret's face. Take your people home. A lanky man with a patchy beard found courage where crowds keep it. You think you're bigger than the town, he shouted. You ain't badge nor judge. Elias stepped down one stair, then another, reaching the yard with the even stride of a man taking out trash. He drew his revolver without flourish, lifted it toward the blue and fired once. The crack ran through the day like a board breaking on an anvil. Horses danced, hats jerked. Even the cottonwood paused. Smoke curled and vanished. Consider that my only warning, he said. Next sound from this yard is the wagon rolling over ground you do not own. Clara's knees trembled. The daisy trembled with them. Yet the sight of him standing there like a lighthouse changed, shaking into memory. She kept her back straight, eyes on the horizon beyond the riders. The male boy swallowed, looked at her, and gave the smallest nod, an apology, trying to become brave. Margaret raised her chin a fraction. "You dare fire on citizens?" "I fired at the sky," Elias said. "The sky can take it. You harbor a blight," she pressed. "Decency requires removal. Decency requires we stop mistaking cruelty for virtue," he said. "This yard is not a court. This cabin raises bread, boils coffee, and mends what can be mended. You will not brand a woman on my steps." A man to the left muttered, "Fool," meaning Elias. Another said, "Sinner," meaning Clara. Dust scratched throats and pride. The crowd had wanted a quick surrender. Refusal thickened the hour into something exhausting to hold. "Last chance," Margaret said. "Send her out or we will come up." Elias holstered the revolver and set both boots square. "You come up that step," he said, "and you meet family." He looked at Clara the way a man looks at a horizon he intends to keep. "Clara Wade lives here as family." The word rolled like thunder along a ridge. Family, not charity, not burden. A label with a lock no mob could pick. Horses blew and shifted, sensitive to changes folks pretend not to feel. Margaret measured the porch. The man, the shell glinting near his boot, ever stood up for someone when no one else would? Tell us in the comments. The male boy had blurted it as if reading a flyer only he could see. Color ran to his ears and stayed there. Margaret found a staircase down that looked like dignity. "We will speak at council," she said. "Do not bring her to market. Keep your doors shut." "My doors open for wind, rain, song, prayer, and neighbors who remember what the word means," Elias said. "They lose their hinge for cowards." She spun the gelding harder than needed, and the ring broke like smoke. Riders peeled away one by one, silence leaking behind them. The bearded man tried to toss a last insult, but his mare stepped on the word and dragged it off. Soon the lane held only a hiss of settling dust, and the faint beat of hooves going townward. Elias waited until the last hat dipped behind the ride. He thumbed the spent casing from the cylinder, slipped it into a pocket, and checked the yard as if fear might have dropped a nail he should pick up. Clara released a breath she had rationed since the first creak of leather. She opened her hand and found the daisy unbroken. She tucked it behind her ear, liking that the gesture felt like bravery and hope at once. Inside, the cabin seemed to grow another wall. Not thicker, exactly, truer. The herbs by the trough drank sunlight and pretended not to have witnessed anything. Elias swung the kettle onto the tea, he said, leaving the cup near her elbow before he went to oil the hinge. He had cursed 2 weeks earlier. Clara pulled the sewing tin across the table, threaded a needle, and unfolded a square of muslin saved from a flour sack. Her fingers shook at first, then found steadiness. She penciled a neat letter in one corner, anchored the shape with a tiny stitch, and began to embroider. White cloth took blue thread like a field, taking rain. She traced the curve, crossed the bar, and made an H that would not fade when washed. She added a narrow border, nothing fancy, only durable. Every pull of the thread said thank you without debt. Elias stepped in to hang a towel and said nothing, which helped more than speeches. He went out to check the fence line. Clara knotted the last tail, bit it clean, and turned the square in her hands. The letter looked sure. She pressed the handkerchief to her lips, tasting chalk from the pencil ghost, then shook it out, so it lay smooth as a promise. Barn air held hay dust and slanted sun. The saddle waited on its peg like a companion returning from a long ride. She slid the handkerchief under the near strap where Elias would lift the rig without looking. A tucked thanks, a quiet vow. Leather smelled of sweat and heat. Elias entered as she reached the door. He saw the corner of white where there had been none. His mouth did not move, yet something in his posture answered. He untucked the square, tied it to the bridle cheekpiece with a knot, sailor's trust, and smoothed the cloth. The letter faced outward, simple, certain. Evening loosened the heat. Elias saddled, bridled, and led the mare out with the patience of a man who knows horses. Learn best when time is respected. He offered Clara the second mount, a bay with an easy eye. "Come, ride," he said. "Rhymes teach what hands forget." She hesitated, then set a boot in the stirrup and swung up, surprised by how clean the motion felt. Elias shortened her strap a notch and tapped the bay's shoulder. Let her walk. Don't steer every inch. Hold, listen, lean when needed. They moved into the lane, dust quiet now, light gentle. A meadowlark wrote music over the fence. The bay's ears flicked, finding rhythm. Clara loosened her grip and felt the horse answer with a softer neck. She breathed pine from Elias's coat and wild sage from the ditch. He rode beside her, hands easy, body showing balance without turning it into a lecture. The path bent toward the creek. She looked where she wanted to go, and the mare drifted there as if thoughts had weight. Her shoulders unknotted, a measure she had not known remained. They crossed shallow water. Stones clicked under iron. Minnows scattered like commas. Give her a little leg now, he said. Clara squeezed the bay, stepped into a willing trot. She matched the motion after one startled bounce. Laughter reached her, quick and bright. They climbed the low ridge east of the cabin and looked back. The roof cut a calm line against a peach sky. The herb bed made two dark seams near the trough, rows that promised more than they demanded. Elias's bridle fluttered, a white square with every stride, shone like a truth a person could choose daily. Clara straightened, not from pride exactly, but from belonging. She set the reins between her fingers, light and steady, and rode beside him, posture straighter. Morning slid in clear and kind, and Clara stepped into the yard, where dew-stitched beads along the herb rows. Time breathed sharp as she pinched tender tips above the second node. Never too greedy, never too shy. Elias came from the barn with a bucket and set it by the trough, nodding towards seedlings that thirsted early. She watered slowly, listening to the soil drink while steam rose from the stovepipe, and the cabin held the smell of pine and iron. She washed, dabbed balm on fading rope burns, and ate, surprised that sweetness could arrive without ceremony. Elias cleaned a bridle on the step, his attention steady and unforced. Fence, after breakfast, he said. Show me, she answered. They walked the line with nails in pockets and wire on their shoulders. Frost and cattle had bullied posts sideways. Elias braced a corner and shaped triangles from spare sticks. Triangles hold, he said. She learned to pull wire firm enough to sing, set staples true, and fall into a rhythm that made effort honest. A sorrel gelding followed and nudged her shoulder with a velvet nose. She startled, laughed, and retied her ribbon. He thinks you hide apples, he said. He reads souls then, she replied. Wind brought a faint rattle of town talk, but it broke on the fence and scattered in the grass. By noon they tightened the last strand and shut the gate with a latch that clicked like a period. They ate in the shade, stew saved from last night, coffee that had ridden the boil, bread that listened to butter. Clara watched sunlight ladder the yard through cottonwood leaves, and thought how safety can look like ordinary chores done without hurry. After the dishes, Elias set a trowel on the stoop. Your garden wants partners, he said. They added dill and feverfew, placing each seed with care and covering the rows with a thin brown veil. Clara leaned back on her heels and felt the earth answer her way. The sky changed while they worked. Clouds shouldered in from the hills, stacking until light went pewter. Wind combed the grass backward. The smell of rain outran the first drops. Clara reached for the herbs under the porch roof. Elias lifted them down with quick, calm hands and carried them inside, slid bars across shutters, checked the latch and pulled an old coat from a peg. The cuffs were scuffed, the lining mended, the shoulders broad from years of weather. He held it out. She slipped her arms through and tugged it close. It felt like armor, not because it could stop lightning, but because someone wanted her dry. They watched rain turn the yard to slate. Lightning stitched seams between hill and cloud. Thunder followed. Clara flinched and counted under her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. Elias brought a stool to the threshold, so she could watch without feeling trapped. Storms pass, he said. They also fill the barrel, with the coat warming her ribs. She let words arrive. Men were cruel, she said, not by accident. They called it a misunderstanding and took what was never offered. Then the town named me the problem so it could sleep. I learned to vanish while standing in a room. Rain worked the roof. Elias did not touch her shoulder. He set a pot on the stove, chopped onions, browned meat, dropped in potatoes, and let the stew thicken. "Eat," he said, sliding a bowl toward her, breaking bread into the broth until it rose like islands. He did not offer pity. He offered stew. She ate until warmth replaced shaking. Outside, the rain eased to a steady breath. "When was the last time a small moment changed everything for you? Share below." The sentence surprised her, a message to strangers she might never meet. "Small holds the roof on," he said. Big blows through. By late afternoon, the rain softened to a silver curtain. Clara carried a bundle to the big barn. Windows patched with tin let down squares of softened light. A warped table leaned against the wall. She scrubbed it, dragged it beneath the skylight, lined up crates for seats, and set out slates she had traded for by mending shirts. Children arrived in pairs and threes, boots muddy, eyes wide. She taught them to measure a field with strides, and to count fence posts between corners. Laughter shook dust from the rafters. A girl with a scabbed knee recited 7 times 4, with proud seriousness. A boy drew a rectangle and called it a pasture, because naming things claims them. Elias watched from the doorway, hat in hand, not entering the circle, not breaking it either. When parents called, class slid away like rain off a roof. Clara wiped chalk with a damp rag and breathed the clean smell of boards after a storm. Evening rested on the land. Frogs tuned their throats near the creek. The air cooled, so the quilt would feel heavy in the right way. Elias oiled tack and set 2 biscuits beneath a cloth for morning. Clara checked the bundles near the hearth and loosened twine where it pinched. She hung the coat back and brushed the collar once with her knuckles, grateful for what it had done. A single rider came up the lane, hooves thickened by mud, lantern hooded low. Elias stepped to the threshold and waited. The stranger kept to the shadows, pushed an envelope across the top step with one gloved finger, and turned away without a word. The seal bore the town's stamp in blue wax. Elias set it on the table and opened it with the knife's point. He read, paused, and read again, jaw tightening by a notch only a careful watcher would notice. He passed the page to Clara. The words marched in tidy rows that tried to sound clean. They were not clean. The council warned it would seize his land for public need, unless she submitted to moral review. It cited old articles. A town keeps for moments when it wants to cause harm with stale law. It named a date and a room. It called her unfit and him reckless. It praised order as if order were a god hungry for offerings. Clara read to the end and felt the air shorten, not as panic, but as weight. The barn where children had recited flipped in her mind's wind like a loose shingle. The garden rose looked suddenly tender as wrist. She set the page down and pressed her palms to the table. Elias folded the letter once and again to make its edges meet. "We will think," he said. "Then we will act." She found the coat again, slipping into it though the night no longer rained. The weight steadied her in the doorway, while frogs sang and the road held its dark. The cost of staying had stepped from rumor into ink. It had signatures. It had neighbors who would nod because nodding costs nothing. Clara stood very straight, feeling fear rise and take its place. Not spectacle, not weakness, only true. She looked toward the barn, toward the rows near the trough, toward the fence they had fixed, until it sang. She did not look away. Afternoon thinned into hard yellow when the court messenger rode up the lane, coat spotless, boots polished as argument. He carried a satchel, sealed in blue wax, and a posture that trusted paper more than people. Elias stepped from the barn, wiped his hands on a rag, and waited at the bottom step. Clara stood in the doorway with his old coat around her shoulders, the hem brushing her calves like a reminder that storms pass and leave tools behind. The messenger glanced at the herb rows, the patched barn window, the tacked handkerchief fluttering on Elias's bridle, and then fixed his gaze on Clara as if she were a ledger line to be balanced. "I am directed by Dry Hollow Council and Justice Avery," he announced. "This notice answers the prior letter. To preserve this parcel for lawful community use, a confession is required. The woman must admit to immoral conduct before witnesses selected by the town. Upon her signature, the council will delay seizure and reconsider. Refusal leaves the homestead subject to immediate action. Clara watched a grasshopper land on the porch rail and rub its wings, singing to no one who mattered to the council. Elias took the envelope without comment, split the seal and unfolded a document, thick as pride. Names marched down the page in tidy lines, accusations paraded behind them, clothed in scripture scraps and bylaw numbers. Clara read the first paragraph, then the second, and felt that old mission silence press against her throat the way a gloved palm once had. She breathed until air came evenly. The messenger mistook composure for surrender. "You understand the mercy offered," he said, softening his voice into something he believed was kind. "Confession cures scandal. The town forgives. The land remains." Elias did not answer for her. He held the paper the way a blacksmith holds a cooling shoe, ready to set it down or change it, only on command. His eyes found hers, steady, gray as a pond under weather. "Do you want to stay?" he asked. The question stood between them like a gate no one else could touch. Clara looked past the messenger's polished buttons toward the trough where dill had sprouted. She saw the barn table rubbed smooth by little elbows, the fence corner braced into triangles, the handkerchief tied to a bridle with a knot that never slipped. She felt the weight of the coat that had warmed her when lightning stitched the sky. Staying meant living under threat, disguised as law. Leaving meant letting that disguise win. The messenger shifted, impatient at the silence that did not serve him. "Miss Wade, your mark here prevents unfortunate proceedings. Signing costs nothing. Defiance costs everything." She remembered fruit exploding against wood, voices delighting in blame, a bell that had ticked like a fuse. She remembered a knife cutting rope with a whisper, and a man who caught her without claiming her. She remembered children counting posts, as if numbers could stitch pasture into safety. She remembered days when she had disappeared while standing in a room. She would not disappear again. "Yes," she said to Elias. "I want to stay." His jaw eased by a degree only a careful soul could measure. He offered the paper back, not as an order but as a choice. The messenger produced a pen from a polished case, held it as priests hold chalices, and extended it with the gravity of ritual. Clara took the sheet instead. The language tried to make her stranger to herself, immoral, incorrigible, pernicious to public virtue. Each word wore borrowed authority like a stolen coat. She thought of girls taught to swallow blame, and men congratulated for theft. Decorated as a charm, ink waited at the line, empty as a trap. Her hands trembled, but not from the old fear that had owned her breath. The tremble belonged to anger, taught manners by love. She lifted the paper until light slid through and revealed a watermark, a property crest that never meant her. The messenger smiled, certain the ritual had worked. Clara set her thumbs at the center, felt the grain, and pulled. The sheet groaned, then yielded. She tore it in half with a sound like cloth ripped from a sack in a square. The messenger flinched, though nothing had touched him. She tore each half again, quarters falling like brittle leaves. She let the pieces slide from her fingers and scatter across the step. "I've survived worse than you," she said, voice quiet, tone level, truth unadorned. "I am not a confession for purchase." Wind lifted the torn quarters, flipped one over the rail, pinned another against the post, and hustled a third toward the trough, where it dunked and sank. The messenger stared, color draining until he matched his collar. He reached for authority with both hands, and found only the empty mouth of his satchel. "You place yourself above the court," he whispered, scandalized in a way that sounded almost devout. "I place her above your convenience," Elias said. He had not moved since the question. Pride sat inside his stillness like a lantern with the flame turned low so as not to blind. "Tell Justice Avery the land remains with its owner until someone braver than paper comes to take it." "You threaten the law," the messenger said. "Law ought to be a fence that keeps wolves out," Elias answered. "You brought a leash meant for prey." He stepped aside not to surrender space, but to give the man a road away from a mistake he would not want to enlarge. The messenger gathered his dignity like a coat after a spill, and stuffed it into the satchel. He glanced at Clara, then looked away because he was stuck. He mounted with effort, turned without flourish, and rode off at a pace that pretended calm, until the bend hid the truth of his retreat. Silence stood where argument had tried to camp. Clara crouched to scoop a fragment from the step. The scrap held the curl of the letter I in immoral. She rubbed it between finger and thumb until the pulp blurred the ink. Paper, when freed from borrowed certainty, returns to fiber and water and the possibility of new shapes. Elias leaned the rag across the rail and studied the sky the way farmers do when the weather thinks about changing. They will come again, he said. Ledger play. Maybe with a writ, maybe with men who prefer fists to stamps. We'll meet them, she said, standing. He nodded once, approval spare as his words. He swept the porch with the old broom that had learned more storms than today. Bits of paper gathered into a small drip. He let the wind steal half and fed the rest to the stove. Fire turned the council's polished phrases into honest light for a waiting kettle. Dusk walked down from the hills. Clara stood beside Elias while purple deepened, and the first star announced evening. Torn paper whispered across the yard, catching on grass, skimming dirt like moths. Thank you, she said. For what? He asked, as if he had fixed a hinge and nothing larger. For asking, only question that mattered, he said. They watched twilight finish its slow work. Someone called, "Good night, Miss Wade." Shyer than yesterday, braver than last week. Elias tipped his hat without turning, letting the sound settle in the wood. Clara took his hand then, not because she needed rescue, but because the world had tried to make her a transaction, and he had refused to trade. His palm was worn from work. They stood while the last scraps of the ruined document slid under the steps and disappeared. The porch held the coat held her, the land held all three, witness and promise. Above the trough, a torn square clung to the stake that marked Dill, one edge fluttering like a tiny flag, meaning only this, defiance, and the right to stay. Dusk settled. Clara and Elias stood listening to the porch boards answer their weight. Across the yard, the herb bed breathed clean after heat, and the creek murmured. Clara lifted one remaining scrap, the seam where her name would have gone, and opened her fingers so the wind could carry it. She did not watch it fly. She watched Elias's profile, calm as air, held promise. Tomorrow I'll teach in the barn, she said. After that we mend the south line. We will, he answered. Lantern light found the edge of his jaw, and for an instant, the day's hardness gentle. They stayed through the first star, through the second, until the sky closed. When they turned in, a few fragments still moved along the yard, harmless as dry leaves. The decision was already larger than paper. It was breath, ground, roof, and the will to remain. We stay, come what may. Behind them the door clicked as a vow. Morning stretched across the pasture, a pale wash turning dew to silver beads along the fence they had mended. Clara swung into the bay's saddle without a hitch, heels light, posture balanced, hands quiet on the reins the way Elias had shown on evenings that smelled of sage and wet clay. The bruises that once shadowed her cheek had faded, and the rope burns wore a faint pink like healed lightning. She guided the mare along the lane while meadowlarks stitched music above the ditch. Elias rode beside her, hat low, relief softening his storm-gray gaze. They crossed the creek and climbed the rise that gives a proper look at the homestead. The new sign he had carved caught the light as if letters could shine by right. Holt Homestead looked truer than vows spoken in rooms that smelled of polish and fear. After breakfast he set tools on the stoop, hammer, pliers, staples, while she sorted seeds and folded dishcloths into neat squares that calmed her hands. He showed her how to test a post by rocking its base until earth answered, how to brace with diagonals because triangles hold. She learned to draw wire until it sang, then fix it without leaving barbs that catch sleeves. A sorrel gelding drifted near and nudged her shoulder with a velvet nose. She laughed, surprised at her own voice, and rubbed the blaze between its eyes. Elias looked up, astonishment briefly unseating vigilance. "He thinks you hide apples," he said. "He reads hearts then," she answered, and ease took root where shame once salted the ground. By noon he had a plank across sawhorses and a board chosen for friendly grain. Clara held a tin of linseed oil and a rag. He sketched with soot, then set the chisel and tapped until curls fell like pale ribbons around his boots. Ha, then O, then L, each stroke patient and exact. Holt Homestead took shape with dignity. When the last letter stood clean, he rubbed oil until the pine darkened. They fixed the sign to the posts they trusted now. A cart slowed. The driver tipped his brim and rolled on. Approval sometimes sounds like silence where scorn lived. The barn held the scent of hay and old rain. Clara opened both doors and chalked numbers on a slate, so white marks leaped for children in the far row. They came with clean faces or smudged chins, some in patched clothes, some in Sunday cloth repurposed. She slid a bucket beneath a drip and shifted the table an inch where light fell more kindly. She taught maps, rivers, distance by stride, showed how to add seed rows and subtract stones from a field that might become generous. She let them write names larger than before, then copy Holt Homestead, not to preach but to prove handwriting can claim place without stealing it. Parents lingered near the door expecting a sermon and hearing a recipe for fairness. A man left apple. A woman set down nails in case the roof remembered squeaking. The schoolhouse burned steadily like a lantern for neighbors at the edge. Whispers in town softened by degrees. No one announced. On market day, when she led the bay along Main to fetch lamp oil and readers, 2 ranch hands touched their brims. The shopkeeper who once measured her with a squint wrapped paper with unhurried care and said, "Afternoon, Miss Wade." Margaret Voss's carriage rolled by with curtains open. Eyes met eyes. No insult was thrown, only a pause and a cool acknowledgement that the weather can shift. Evenings Clara read while Elias repaired the harness or mapped the next stretch of fence. On the mantel he kept the casing from the day he fired into the sky, not as a boast but as a rule. Warnings count only if kept. She told him her first memory of a bed that belonged to no one but chores and prayer. A pallet under a window where frost once painted leaves she traced until the sun took them. "I dreamed a place without inspection," she said. "A door that opens for wind and friends, not for judgment." He listened like a man studying a pass before snow. And what else? A shelf for books, a table long enough for whoever arrives, quilts on a line, a bell that means soup, not scolding. Within days he replaced the latch, smoothed the sill, and hung a blue curtain she picked from a peddler's trunk. He built shelves for readers and chalk, shaved a peg for her shawl, and repaired the small barn window with rescued glass. He planted a young cottonwood near the trough so afternoon shade would fall across the herbs like a hand blessing a brow. The table grew a leaf, plain, smooth as a river stone. Bowls matched at last, not by cost but by care. Trust returned like muscle after illness, slow, then suddenly present. Clara rode mornings to check the east gate and came home with her shoulders looser than when she left. She gathered chamomile after the dew lifted, brewed a pot for a mother whose worries stole sleep, and carried jars to a porch where a husband had sprained an ankle. Children arrived early with eggs or flour, and notes that said simply thank you or drew flowers, where letters still resisted. In the lane, a rancher who had once joined a jeer now studied the sign and nodded, as if the carving had straightened something inside his chest. Rain visited and left the air clean. They sat on the step watching drops slide off the sign in measured beads. Clara spoke of the mission again, not to reopen wounds but to clear rooms that still held old air. She told of the woman with the hard jaw who checked corners with white gloves and called her cursed when the cloth showed gray. The soft-voiced man who used piety like a door he closed after entering. The way apologies were demanded of the wrong person so the town could sleep. Elias folded a patch strap and set it aside. He did not end the talk with pity. He said, "There's stew," handed her a bowl, and broke bread into it until islands rose. She ate until warmth put a floor under her feet. "When was the last time a small moment changed everything for you?" "Share below," she murmured. "Small holds the roof on," he answered. "Big blows through." The school grew. She taught letters with rivers and sums with feed sacks. She let shy voices try out loudness and stubborn ones practice listening. She wrote Holt Homestead above the door and watched children straighten as if chalk could lengthen spines. Some evenings she and Elias walked the herb rows. He showed how to pinch basil without scaring it, how to loosen soil around roots with a spoon, how to read leaves the way riders read clouds. The sorrel nosed her pocket again, and she laughed, brighter this time. He looked over, surprised still, and a softer surprise followed. The knowledge he could get used to that sound. One dusk she folded laundry and spoke a wish kept like a coin under the tongue. A home without shame. He stood in lamplight and measured that wish by what 2 hands could promise before winter. Next morning, the door frame held a bell he'd hung from braided rawhide. Its voice called soup, not scolding. A week later, a rocker appeared by the window, sanded smooth where old varnish had turned mean. The shawl peg fit her palm, the shelves held books, the porch gained a rail that kept rain off boots. He announced none of it. Dawn arrived and showed what had changed. On a Sunday quiet enough to hear flies hum, he carried a small anvil to the porch table with a torch, a file, and a coil of mild steel wire. He cut a length, heated it until it turned peach, curved it around a round drift, filed where ends met, and silver sodded the seam until it disappeared. He quenched, polished with emery, and rubbed the circle until it shone without shouting. His hand stayed steady while the work required care. His heart, ordinary when hauling posts, made itself known against his rib. He set the ring inside a matchbox lined with cloth cut from his shirt cuff, closed the lid, and slipped the box into his vest. He looked toward the ridge where the prairie falls away like a promise, and breathed slowly. Tomorrow, he thought. Maybe tomorrow. He breathed again and felt courage settle, steady in his hands yet unsure in his chest. Tomorrow, perhaps on the ridge in the evening, he would ask the question, as simple as steel and as heavy as hope. Evening drew a thin silver edge along the hills as wind combed the grass flat and shining. Elias led the bay and sorrel up the trail, reins slack, hat brim shading eyes taut by long miles. Clara rode beside him with a shawl at her waist, and his old coat rolled behind the cantle. They climbed to the ridge where prairie opened, so wide a person felt taller for looking. They stepped down onto warm stone. Elias looped reins over a juniper and laid a palm on rock. He watched swallows punch neat holes in the sky, then faced Clara as a man studies a pass before winter. Her hair was pinned with a few wisps freed by the breeze, eyes steady. He drew one breath to settle the courage that had been tapping his ribs since dawn. "I have no speech," he said. "Only a truth that won't sit still." He opened a small matchbox lined with a cuff cloth and showed a steel ring, simple as a good loop in a fence, polished until it held dusk. No debts, just choice. Clara's breath hitched. Memory crossed her in clean flashes, rope-burning skin, fruit bursting on wood, a boy's shy nod, children counting posts under patched light, a bell that meant soup, a shelf waiting for books, a sign raised without permission. The ring shone like a small sunrise. Warm ache gathered under her ribs, the feeling of doors opening. "Yes," she whispered, tears bright as if wind had turned kind. "Yes." Elias slid the ring over her finger, not claiming, only fitting promise to bone. Wind lifted a hawk. It rode an invisible river until it shrank to a dot. They stood with hands linked and did not hurry words. Silence grew from comfort, not fear. "What's a moment when someone saw you for who you are? Share it with us," she murmured toward the horizon, half laughing. He smiled, surprise loosening guarded years, and tucked the box away. On the porch he touched the brass casing on the rail like a charm, then swung the door in the small ceremony the home deserves. By lamplight she turned her hand and watched the ring catch gold like a secret dawn. He stirred the stove, ladled stew, tore bread, and they ate hip to hip while crickets tuned the dark. Plans arrived in the tone used for work that matters. "Birch," she said. "The one by the north meadow bends like a blessing." "No priest," he answered. "Just truth." "Wildflowers," she said. "Crowns, if my fingers remember." "Crowns then," he said. Morning woke pale. Neighbors came without uniforms for judgment, only shirts that had been washed, boots with gravel in their seams. Children ran in delighted loops and brought daisies, yarrow, and larkspur. A fiddle found a tune that turned road dust into river shine. Clara wore the dress she had fixed herself in, seams neat, courage brighter, her hair coiled simply. Elias had scrubbed his collar and pressed his sleeves. They stood beneath the birch, whose pale bark held sunlight. The town lingered at a respectful distance, even some who once threw words sharp as nails. Elias took Clara's hands like a craftsman, receiving a tool made to fit. I vow to build, not brand, to stand between you and storms when I can, and fetch wood when I cannot. I vow to ask before deciding. His voice did not rise. It carried because he meant each plank. Clara answered with words that poured clean. I vowed to keep a table where stories sit safely, to teach what steadies, to speak truth even when quiet would buy ease. I vow to ride beside you when the trail is kind and when it is cruel, and to hold our roof steady with small, steady days. No priest spoke. The birch answered with light. Children clapped because weddings deserve it. She set a crown of wildflowers on her head, and another on his, laughing when larkspur leaned toward his ear like a blue secret. They kissed, ordinary, exact, sealing a gate they had hung together. When dusk leaned on the meadow, the neighbors drifted home, quite a wide settlement. They sat on the step and watched stars stack over the ridge. Days knit forward. The schoolhouse outgrew crates and a rescued table. Elias planned a bench and worried splinters until the boards felt like kindness. Clara chalked sums, maps and recipes for fairness. She taught songs that carried shy voices into daylight. In the evening, they walked the rows, dill feathery and stubborn, basil asking to be pinched, feverfew bright as small sun. They spoke of a room that might hold a cradle, then let the idea rest without debt or fear. Autumn brushed gold along cottonwood leaves, and wrote lace on the pump handle. Work kept its rhythm. He mended harness, checked cattle, traded for nails, and brought back pocket stones called stories. She taught, listened, mended, and learned the name of every hill, until the land felt like a long prayer that never required kneeling. When the wind slid through a seam, he hung another quilt and sealed the edge with felt. When she coughed, he warmed honey and thyme, and stood by without fuss until breath smoothed. Life, not legend, proved the vows. A letter with tidy threats arrived and met the stove. A small purse showed up with no name. An apology folded small. Meetings in town grew quieter around the edges, where shouts had lived. Winter dropped a hard blue, and laid snow that squeaked. The birch wore a white crown. Near the hearth stood a cradle planed smooth and rubbed with oil until the wood glowed. Elias carved a little bird along the rail because hands like to leave proof a person can touch when dusk feels long. Clara rested when she should, and moved when she could, humming counting tunes. Children loved. On a knife-cold night wind tore at eaves, then stilled as if the house had inhaled and waited. Before the sun, a cry lifted and rewrote every room. Elias caught his breath the way men do when awe surprises them. Clara held a daughter while dawn smudged the window gray. They named her Lila for the hope that stays when lamps go out. Fingers like seeds curled around her thumb. While he kissed a downy brow, the ring flashed once and went on with its quiet job. Spring loosened snow. Grass pushed up with stubborn joy. Clara pinned a fresh sign above the barn door. Chalk dust soft across her knuckles. Lila's corner, it read, because some places deserve to remember beginnings each day. Children crowded under it, pointing, laughing, learn. Mothers rocked babies and traded recipes. Fathers fixed a hinge, a wheel, a worry. Elias leaned on the rail, hat low, eyes warm, watching lessons become shelter that asked nothing. A person couldn't pay with patience and neighbors had. When the sun slid down, Clara carried Lila across the yard where shadows laced the grass. She paused beneath the birch and touched a leaf like a thank you. The ring felt light and sure. Elias met them at the step with a blanket, tucked it around both and held the door. Inside the bell spoke soup, not scolding. Outside the sign spoke welcome. Prairie breath matched the houses, steady as a heart, learning its own rhythm and meaning to keep it as long as dawns arrived. For good. Morning found Dry Hollow softened by late spring light. Clara walked into town with Lila snug against her chest, the sling tied firm, the baby's breath a warm rhythm under her palm. Elias had ridden north, with salt and a kiss for their daughter's brow. Wind carried bakery sweetness. Hammers tapped neat music. A bell marked the hour without insisting. She passed the mercantile where once a clerk had weighed her with a squint and now wrapped paper with care. A woman at the pump shifted to offer space. A ranch hand who had shouted in the square months back tipped his brim and looked at his boots, cheeks tight with learning. Clara answered each meeting with a nod that did not punish and did not bend. She stopped at the schoolroom that had begun as a barn and now wore windows clear as creek water. Children who had called her names once whispered them like apologies and reached for slates stacked in a row. She set Lila in a basket padded with Elias's old shirt and tied a ribbon to the handle so the baby could study a bright thing that kept fear from learning her face. Lessons ran steady, letters traced with patience, numbers counted in strides, stories told about rivers, storms, seeds, and fairness. She taught a rule that fit inside any day: measure twice, harm none, mend what you touch, then watched quiet courage show itself in small hands that used to close around stones. At noon she led them to the square where a crude history had tried to write her name small. The post remained, weathered, leaning a shade south as if the ground had tugged. No rope hung there now. A swallow had nested in a notch near the top. Clara placed her palm on the wood, feeling heat stored from the honest sun. Little shoes scuffed near her. A boy who had thrown pebbles, but now carried readers, stared at the grain as if it could answer a question he could barely hold. "This," she said, voice even, gaze steady, "is where he chose me." The boy nodded, learning a definition that would stay when arithmetic blurred. A girl stood straighter, eyes fierce for reasons she had not yet named. Shopkeepers watched from doors, pretending to tidy displays while listening for a tone they had never heard and wanted anyway. The sheriff, older, leaned 2 storefronts down and touched his hat. Not tribute, not penance, only recognition of weight wrongly placed and finally moved. Clara lifted Lila and kissed her temple. The child made a sound not quite laughter, and not quite song. Beneath it she heard an echo she hoped Dry Hollow would learn: mercy spoken without price. She led the children back, reading signs along the way. The one at the lane stood proud, oiled dark in letters carved with patience: Holt Homestead, Elias, Clara, Lila. The names held like posts braced against the weather, not to keep neighbors out but to keep courage in. She let small hands trace the letters until memory could hold them without chalk. Afternoon turned clapboard to honey. Mothers set jars on the rail, beans, peaches, balm, apologies folded into sweetness. Fathers fixed a hinge or offered nothing but a steady presence where jeers had lived. A veteran lifted Lila with careful hands and returned her with a smile that loosened 2 winters from his brow. The mail boy, taller now, brought a packet of slates and 3 soft sentences he had practiced all week. He left lighter. The council clerk paused at the door with a ledger closed. He asked after readers and said the council would fund more, then taught himself how to stand in silence without pretending to lead it. Clara returned the room to order, stacked slates, rinsed rags and swept dust toward the light as if making space for next chances. In the doorway she saw the road where she had first ridden away in a wagon that felt like a question answered kindly. She pictured the ridge where Elias had opened a small box and set a future on her palm with 6 words that built a country. No debts, just choice. She pictured a document turned to ash, a handkerchief tied to leather, a sign raised without permission. A life had been built in such increments, each too small to boast and too strong to break. She dismissed class with a blessing disguised as a reminder: walk carefully, speak truth, share bread, ask before deciding, fix what you break. Children scattered like starlings, promises in shoes. She lifted Lila again and walked the long way past the blacksmith, the mill, and the water tower. At the trough, Dill and Basil breathed clear, a garden made by hands that preferred stewardship to ownership. Beyond the fence, cattle worked grass down to smooth green, and above them swallows wrote quick loops. On Market Street, a butcher who once smirked stepped from his threshold and said, "Ma'am," as if the word had been waiting, and a seamstress pressed a length of blue ribbon into Clara's hand for the baby. A pair of ranch hands who had laughed unloaded a sack of feed by the schoolhouse and left without names. Not everyone spoke. A few glanced down, cheeks taut with shame, and swept their stoops twice. Evening lowered itself over roofs. Elias rode in dusty and content, rope coiled. He saw Clara, saw Lila, and the line between duty and joy vanished. He dismounted and set his cheek briefly to the baby's hair. Neighbors pretended not to watch and watched anyway, learning a language no sermon had taught. A man who had muttered sinner asked if the school needed kindling. Clara thanked him, and let the word become a board in a bridge. Margaret Voss passed with the curtains open, and met Clara's eyes. No insult traveled. Her chin lifted a fraction, a bow shaped from fact, if not affection. They turned toward home, while the sky practiced the pink it saves for certain evenings. The sign waited at the lane, bold and decent. Holt Homestead, Elias, Clara, Lila. A hawk circled once, then slid east. The cottonwood lifted its hands to bless supper. On the step a child from class arrived, breathless, and held out a drawing. 3 figures under a birch, a small one in the middle, crowns like wildflowers, a house in the corner with smoke curling straight up. Clara smoothed the paper and pinned it by the door where wind could lift a corner, and remind them what had changed. Night gathered. Lila slept with the relaxed certainty of a child who has never been pried. Elias set bread down. Clara stirred stew. The room learned again how to hold peace without hoarding it. Outside, the old post caught fewer glances, not because memory had thinned, but because understanding was doing better work. In town, some people prayed without word. Others rehearsed apologies they could not yet deliver, and fixed windows instead, which would do for now. Clara stood in the doorway and let the air cool her cheeks. She thought of every woman still standing under eyes that confuse harm with holiness, every man learning how to use a back for shelter, and not for turning. She thought of Lila's corner glowing like a lantern across years she could not yet name. She felt Elias's hand find hers, warm from work, tender without display. The world had tried to trade her for quiet once. She had chosen a voice instead, and that voice had learned how to teach. She turned, lifted Lila from the basket, and tucked the blanket beneath a small chin. The baby sighed and curled a fist around the ribbon. Elias stepped onto the porch and looked toward town. Roads calmer, he said. Not finished. Better. Clara nodded. They're learning, she answered. So am I. She glanced at the horizon where lanterns pricked to life and thought how a square had once meant harm, and now could mean gathering, if people chose it. She faced the darkening line of hills, then the door, then the camera of any heart. Listen. If Clara and Elias's story of love and redemption moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Frontier Love Tales for more stories of courage and second chances. Ride with us again, partner.